Do you remember those old middle-class foods, the ones you could only find in cookbooks no one opens anymore? Back then, these meals filled busy weeknights and worn kitchen tables with something warm, practical, and proudly homemade. What did we lose when we stopped cooking like that? Rye porridge is a pretty regional dish that never happened to be mainstream American breakfast even in the 50s, but it was definitely something that would have varying levels of popularity. If you were in New York or something, you'd never see the damn thing, but if you tripped on over to Minnesota, Wisconsin, North Dakota, or just anywhere with a lot of Scandinavian American presence, you'd see a lot of this. In take areas I am Mentinoed, you'd see it just because that was where rye was most commonly grown. For the Scandinavian part, it became a cultural tradition within their community to rely on rye, and one of the most popular and easy to make recipes for anyone was just rye porridge. It's something that's made with rye flour and foraged berries, or sometimes molasses. Rye porridge was praised for actually being way ahead of its time. It was high fiber, nutritious, and in the 50s it was one of the healthiest things you could eat. Most American families were relying on oatmeal, but rye porridge was just as capable, at least nutrition-wise. And slightly cheaper, too. So, Elios Pizza is a frozen pizza with a distinct rectangular shape known for its crispy crust and savory toppings. This convenient meal was introduced in 1963 by Elios, becoming a staple for quick and easy dinners. The pizza was developed with the intention of providing a straightforward and reliable frozen meal option for families. The original recipe featured a crispy crust that provided a satisfying crunch, complemented by the tangy tomato sauce and melty cheese. Elios Pizza is typically cut into square slices, making it easy to share or customize with different toppings. The rectangular shape also made it easy to fit into toasters and ovens for quick reheating. We've got one thing straight: meat was scarce during the dust storm era, so jackrabbits became a surprising alternative. These nimble critters were abundant in the wild, and they provided a valuable source of protein. Jackrabbits were often stewed or roasted, and its meat was said to be quite flavorful when prepared correctly. Jackrabbits, those long-eared critters that seemed to hop faster than a speeding bullet, became a potential meal. I'm not sure how they caught them, but I imagine it was a wild chase through a dust storm. Cooking jackrabbit was more of a skill than creativity, and preparing this dinner was a labor of hard work, as it was a lean meat that needed to be tenderized and seasoned well, but when done right, it was totally worth it. Boiled carrot sandwiches was created from the weird culinary gap left by increasing prices and thinner savings accounts. Like we said, people wanted vegetables that ticked the cheaper and tastier most boxes for them. However, even that was getting tough. Some of the worst stretches of the Great Depression left people with frustrations and creativity alike. Whipping up dishes like this was common, and the boiled carrot sandwich definitely stayed during the time because of its simplicity. Americans love a good sandwich, and they adore an easy-to-cook filling. Boiled carrot sandwiches definitely met most of the criteria, as roasting cheese to create an open-faced sandwich was a popular choice. Suffering the same fate as other dishes on this list, the boiled carrot sandwich eventually died out as economic growth increased in America. The next thing we have on the list is salmon croquettes with creamed spinach. Now, on paper, this sounds like just what you would need, right? It's salmon, so there's protein. It's creamed spinach, so you definitely have a side that's jam-packed with nutrition. I mean, it seems ideal, the kind of thing you'd always want to be eating at work. For a long time in the 80s, that was how it worked too. People, particularly those working office and desk jobs, were very fond of this kind of lunch. It was also the perfect change in flavors from what people were originally used to. However, this was probably even more reliant on advanced preparation than egg salad stuffed tomatoes. That just wouldn't work with the way so many people were re-entering the workforce in the second half of the 20th century. It basically meant that your wife would have to stay at home and do kitchen duties every day, and most wives were opting to go to work instead. Labor-intensive meals like this, as a result, just didn't last in the long haul. In the 1960s, if you went for duck à l'orange, it would run you around 40 to 90 cents. and that would heavily depend on the level of sophistication you could expect from the place you were going to. The orange juice here really wasn't anything, almost a non-factor really. The sauce, therefore, was pretty expensive. It was something that adventurous and daring home cooks tried to incorporate into their home menus, but it was something that was best left to restaurants and French chefs who really knew how to do it well. That is, until Julia Child made these dishes super accessible with all of her work as a television star. Northeast California and Chicago were cities with all kinds of populations of French popular. Duck wasn't really the most popular ingredient, at least not like it is now. This dish was one of the few ones that really popularized the potential duck had as a high-class food, but it was still not what you would call gourmet food or fine dining. The rick and savoriness of the duck meat coupled with the crispiness of the duck skin was really something to behold though. Plus, all the aromatics like shallots and garlic were to die for. It was something that you would see in fine dining places and restaurants in California, but those were few and far between, and they were handled by some very top-of-the-line chefs. Duck wasn't really an everyday meat. Of course, even if inflation didn't happen, since it's just more popular now, it would still be some decently pricey game. But around the 60s, it was something most middle-class families could afford to save up for if they tried. Mrs. Paul's fish sticks are frozen breaded fish sticks, often served with tartar sauce or ketchup. These crispy and mild-flavored seafood sticks were introduced by Mrs. Paul's in the 1940s and became a family favorite. The fish sticks are made from white fish, such as cod or pollock, which is breaded and fried to create a crunchy coating. The fish sticks could be baked or fried, allowing for versatility in preparation, and they were often served with sides like fries or coleslaw for a complete meal. Mrs. Paul's fish sticks were particularly popular among children, who enjoyed their mild flavor and crunchy texture. They were among the first frozen seafood products to gain widespread acceptance, thanks to their consistent quality and taste. Hash brown casseroles didn't really become what they're most commonly associated with today, the Cracker Barrel. In the 50s, they were a dish that was commonly occupying the spaces of church cookbooks and the refrigerators of many middle-class families. In the Midwest and the South, you honestly just had this and nothing else for a lot of weeks. Hash browns were also homemade instead of being cheap roadside diner food, probably reusing yesterday's batter or hash browns. These ones weren't frozen either. They were all made from freshly grated potatoes or iced ones, and then mixed in with cheese, cream, and butter. Then, canned soup was used as a base for it, and again, you have your typical cream of something from Campbell's. This was basically a big part of the reason that the casserole boom happened, though, towards the end of the 50s. It was one of the first dishes that showed most middle-class families just how much of a soldier Campbell's soup really could be, and how it could be the perfect base for a casserole dish. From there on, it just became a regular sight at most potlucks and church dinners. Now, if you think baking a cake without eggs, milk, or butter sounds impossible, think again. During the Dust Bowl, people got creative with their baking. This egg-free, milk-free, and butter-free cake was made with simple ingredients like flour, sugar, and vegetable oil. It was impossible to live without cake even in times of desperation, so people decided to make do without the fancy ingredients. Now, I know eggs, milk, and butter don't sound fancy to us, but these ingredients were a luxury to find during the Dust Bowl days, and even if you did find some, it was never enough to whip up a whole cake. The cake might not have been as rich as its traditional counterparts, but it was a sweet treat that offered a bit of comfort during difficult times. Cabbage and noodles typically just looked like a pound of cabbage and a medium serving of noodles. More or less, it was not the most expensive dish, and you could enjoy a bowl by making it pretty quickly. Away from the pancake and pie-addled fanatics or admirers of noodles across the states, everyone needs their cravings satisfied from time to time, even if the soaring prices spared no one. In some areas, cabbage and noodles was known as halusky. However, in most places, it was simply referred to as cabbage and noodles, the most typical Depression-era noodle recipe. It's a must-have that needed to be in your repertoire if you were to survive the times and not forget every taste you ever loved. Someone really needs to study how times like these bring out everyone's culinary creativity. The phrase, Mock crab salad sandwich might invoke images of cheap sandwiches that were built to just look like a crab sandwich, but if I've earned your trust at all so far, then keep an open mind because this is actually a wonderful example of American ingenuity. So, mock food came out as a result of the Depression. Most people just couldn't really afford things like crab or red meat or any kind of meat, really. I mean, with the war rationing and everything, you pretty much had what you could hunt in the wild and the cheap cuts of meat that no one would really buy. Mock food was a way for people to get some flavors they were sorely missing. It stayed a long while even after the Depression, since thanks to urbanization, there were less and less coastal cities, bodies of water, and more. Otherwise, there used to be a time where crab was so abundant that it was cheap. Anyway, for this mock food imitation, what people would do is use cod or haddock instead, and the salad was just a basic mayo-celery mix with French or vinegar dressing. You'd lay that on some soft rolls, and you'd actually have a pretty good dish. The thing is, mock food culture is entirely a thing of the past now, and most of these recipes have been lost. Beef bourguignon in the 1960s in America was something that was a lot more affordable than you would originally think. See, the way beef developed, it was becoming too popular and common for the government to not do something about the price. It settled around 50 to 80 cents a pound, making it a pretty cost-effective dish for what it was worth. The rest, you just needed a couple of dollars for, vegetables and table wine included. French influences like Julia Child and her book, Mastering the Art of French Cooking, a 1961 classic, made beef bourguignon something that home cooks could finally begin trying in real life. See, while beef was getting more affordable, it wasn't exactly something people could ever experiment with. If your idea went wrong, you just wasted some beef. Or worse, you wasted a pound of it. The vegetables and wine were really replicable, but a lot of people couldn't stand wasting beef, especially since not everyone lived near butcher shops. Anyway, now that we have that out of the way, let's talk about some areas where this dish thrived. So, whether it's Connecticut or Detroit, Chicago, or New York, you'll find lots of places in history cashing in on the trend of beef bourguignon. This, after all, was where it made its name. Even in places like Minneapolis and Massachusetts, French influence had people by a chokehold. The savoriness and tanginess from the red wine reduction was something that drew more and more customers to restaurants every day. The tightly sealed in and dense flavor from the extensive braising made this a standout dish, one to remember, and definitely one to tell your friends about. By the 50s, wine culture in America still hadn't taken its exact shape, not like the one we know today, but a big proponent of that culture was the nationally shared experience of having a killer pot roast with some wine. Middle-class American families needed a break from the cheap bear at Josie's in Hell's Kitchen, you know? They needed to feel fancy about themselves too. Put on that greatest suit, shine those shoes, use that chapstick, and go out for some wining and dining. Pot roasts were pretty much your typical affair, and this was the kind of meal people would save up for or keep for special occasions, or just when they wanted a fun night to help pick people's moods back up at home. Some of the best wines that were served with pot roasts, which were usually typically pork, beef, or chicken, were California Burgundies, which was really just an umbrella term for a dry red blend. Then you had California Zinfandel, or you could just keep it simple with some sherry. Next time you get a pot roast going, try some wine with it. It's a tried and tested classic. JellO pudding pops are frozen pops made from JellO pudding, offering a creamy and smooth texture. These treats come in various flavors, including chocolate, vanilla, and swirl, and were a favorite among kids for their rich taste. Introduced by JellO in the 1970s, these pops became a popular frozen dessert option, combining the beloved flavors of JellO pudding with the refreshing qualities of a frozen treat. The pops are made by blending JellO pudding mix with milk and freezing the mixture into popsicle molds. The result is a creamy, icy pop that melts in your mouth, delivering a burst of flavor with every bite. The idea for these pops stemmed from the popularity of pudding as a comfort food, and JellO capitalized on this by creating a frozen version that was easy to enjoy on the go. These treats were also popular at birthday parties, where kids loved the creamy texture and delicious flavors. Cornish game hens were a pretty forgettable moment in American history, to be honest. I mean, no wonder they are on this list after all. So, Cornish game hens were something that were a tiny bit more costly than chicken, but still relatively affordable. The minimum price for a game hen would be around 80 cents, with most places easily coming to or exceeding $1. These were also sold frozen, which was really a massive draw for people to start buying these. See, before, you had to pretty much take the entire bird home and find a way to use it unless you were okay with wasting precious meat. These individual frozen servings meant that people could pick and choose the amount of meat they actually wanted to buy. This was actually something of a fine dining moment too for places like Los Angeles and San Francisco, although it was something that went for a good price in most upscale restaurants, but still it didn't have a lot of star power. The flavors were soft and mild, and you had to really chew to get a sense for what you were having. It didn't last long beyond the 60s, and I get it. This decade is full of things to talk about, seriously. Liverwurst and onion sandwiches were a really straightforward dish. There wasn't a lot going on here, and it was really just a 3-ingredient dish. Finally, we're going to back sandwiches we can actually recognize and digest. Who has their stuff cold? Not me. Liverwurst and onion sandwiches luckily aren't exactly things you serve cold either. This is a dish best served piping hot. See, liverwurst in itself is just a sausage that's been made with liver and some other parts of meat. Then you take in some raw onions and sauté them, serve them between slices of toasted bread with cheese, and there you go. Liverwurst is something we got from European and German communities, and it was really popular in areas like Detroit and Pennsylvania, where there were strong populations of European communities. Liverwurst was typically always blended with warm spices like allspice and nutmeg too, so you could either make it into this flavorful pâté or slice it and layer it with other kinds of things as well as cheese, of course. It's something that just faded out of relevance, though. It wasn't bad or impractical, but I guess it was a little too simple. So, chicken cordon bleu is another funny one. It's something that is strictly middle class, but you can just tell this dish is trying to be something more. The fascination that the American population had with French and European cuisine and culture in the middle of the 60s was definitely interesting. It was a fascination that went into our cookbooks, our magazines, our media and movies, our dinners and our parties and our restaurants. So you have to think, how did it really get this far? Well, again, it's kind of what I said before. Americans got tired of the typical, the regular, the mundane. They didn't want the same Monday to Friday menu they were used to, both at their regular joints and at home. They wanted fresh new flavors. Why do you think out of all the things that got popular and ended up being nation-swooping trends, fusion food and hybrid experimentations were the ones that took the cake? It's because more than anything, after a first half of the century that put them through the ringer and a diet that hadn't changed in over a century, people just wanted something new. Chicken cordon bleu was a fresh and interesting new way of having chicken breasts. It was cheap, affordable, and it came in frozen packets, which made it all the more convenient. And don't let anyone ever tell you we didn't get inspired by the French either. Milk toast is exactly what the name suggests. Toasted to perfection bread dipped in milk with a generous slap of butter. On days when any meal you loved was unaffordable and getting up to cook something proper was dreadful, milk toast came through for many families. All you needed was some good fresh bread and a warm glass of milk to gorge on until you felt full. Milk toast quickly became one of the most popular breakfasts in the States, catering specifically to people below the poverty line who could not make most of the items on this list regularly. Nowadays, this might be considered a very vintage meal, the type to get kids asking you what century you might be from. But back then, it was something even working-class 20-year-olds would eat daily. Times have changed, and the breakfast of people in those socioeconomic classes is definitely different. Pickled beet and goat cheese sandwiches were like pretty much the same thing as a lot of the recipes from the Depression era that you see persisting beyond the 50s. There's something that people back then acquired a taste for, but this combo really brought out the best of them too. Chèvre, or as we know it, goat cheese, was something that was actually not too popular in America though. It was something that French, Spanish, and Italian immigrants popularized, but it was something that was originally first introduced in America by European settlers. For most of the 17th and 18th centuries, It was a niche thing. Not exactly the main character or a big part of the B-plot, but it was a good extra in the background, sometimes the foreground, know what I mean? Lots of small-scale farming and goat dairy farms did start to open up in places like Wisconsin, Oregon, California, and Vermont, and when the health scares started, the government only started pushing things like goat's cheese more. It wasn't a big stretch to move towards sandwiches then, and the beet and goat cheese combo was already something that worked. In today's day and age, this sandwich just isn't flashy, substantial, or tasty enough to last, though. But some people still keep it as a vegan-friendly option. What's not to love about a 3-ingredient delicious sauce? White sauce was the comforting meal you look forward to coming home to every night. It was a break from the bland foods of the dirty 30s, and the best part? It required just 3 common ingredients that were already staples in everyone's kitchen: flour, butter, and milk. This sauce is like an easy-breezy addition of the bechamel sauce, which is one of the mother sauces of French cuisine. This sauce is made from a white roux and milk, seasoned with ground nutmeg. Since we didn't have fancy ingredients on hand, the simple ones did the job. This sauce was used to top pasta, vegetables, casseroles, and even lasagnas. If you were lucky enough to have a bit of cheese in your pantry, it could be turned into a cheesy sauce. If you had some herbs, it could be seasoned to add extra flavor. And let's be honest, in tough times, a little creamy sauce can make everything taste just a bit better. Banquet fried chicken consists of frozen fried chicken pieces that offer a convenient and tasty meal option. Introduced in 1953 by Banquet Foods, Banquet fried chicken quickly became a staple in American households, especially appreciated for its ability to provide a classic comfort food with minimal effort. The chicken is typically made from breaded and seasoned chicken parts, such as drumsticks, thighs, and breasts, which are then fried to a golden brown. Banquet fried chicken was often served with sides like mashed potatoes, green beans, or corn, creating a complete meal that was easy to prepare and enjoy. The convenience of frozen fried chicken made it an ideal choice for busy nights or casual gatherings, providing an easy meal that didn't skimp on flavor. Pudding was one of the most decadent and delightful dishes you could ever have. It was something that was also prepared drastically differently than what you see available today, even in most homes. Back then, the idea really was to use a stovetop for all of your pudding-related needs. People would cook it from scratch, use milk, sugar, cornstarch, and lots of egg yolks, and then thicken it for a long time over some medium heat on the stovetop. This went for pretty much the most popular kinds of flavors like chocolate, vanilla, butterscotch, and banana, which also had local products that helped give it more of a kick. If you were having chocolate pudding, you would throw in stuff like Hershey's cocoa powder or Baker's chocolate. If you had vanilla, then you would have Watkins or McCormick or Nilla wafers for banana pudding. Most people would also serve these in glass dishes instead of big bowls, but it was a really nice experience. Who doesn't love the aroma of a good homemade casserole? Well, this hearty meal was still winning hearts even during the Dust Bowl days. Now, during the Dust Bowl, casseroles weren't the fancy, cheesy concoctions we know today. They were more like a hodgepodge of whatever was on hand. Leftover vegetables, some mystery meat, maybe some canned beans, all thrown together in a baking dish. Not exactly Instagram-worthy, but it was a way to use up scraps and fill up the dining table. Plus, they were the stars of potlucks and holiday dinners. This was the era of coming up with all different recipes for casseroles and everything from hash brown casseroles to tuna noodle casseroles. These recipes were passed down from generation to generation and made their way to us. Casseroles were the kind of dish that brought people together, not just because they were filling, but because they were often made with love and shared with family and friends. They were a reminder that even in the hardest of times, people found ways to come together and enjoy a meal. Now, speaking of retro, tuna jelly salad was a really vintage recipe that started coming into the spotlight around the 60s. This was the time when JellO and gelatin mold-based dishes were getting really popular. The idea was to use the gelatin mold to encase the tuna with a typical salad dressing, and it really worked back then. I'm not exactly sure how people would react to it now, since I think the idea of a tuna and gelatin crossover is a bit too bold for a lot of people's palates. I could always be wrong though, so you tell me, dear viewer. Would you take a tuna jelly salad to work? Or would you just make a quick run for the nearest Wendy's? I wouldn't blame you at all if you picked the second one. The idea behind salads like these was to throw a spin on an otherwise really boring format of cooking. Salads were okay, but they were never something Americans preferred with their whole hearts. Nowadays, that opinion really started to become public sentiment. Plus, as I was previously talking about, most people would opt for Starbucks now. And I'll tell you this right now, tuna, JellO, and caffeine do not go together. Vinegar pie is the rather odd dish on this list that proves that at times of desperation, anyone will eat anything. Vinegar pie started spreading infectiously out of states like Pennsylvania in the start of the 1930s and tops even Dandelion Salad when it comes to being budget-friendly. All you would need is an open crust, vinegar, sugar, and some eggs to create this unique pie. To cover the mediocre taste, people would coat the crust with a meringue. It was an affectionate treat to bring in case of a celebration and was easy to make if you had a sweet craving. The dish was also pretty delicious if you were able to get over the sour vinegar taste and focus on the meringue. People really wanted a sweet treat at the end of a hard week spent cutting corners and working long hours, and small joys like vinegar pies were what kept people sustained. Carrot marmalade came to the rescue when gelatin and popcorn weren't doing much for the taste buds. Now, marmalade usually involves citrus fruits, but during the Dust Bowl, folks had to get creative. This was a pairing that ensured nothing went to waste in the kitchen, including carrots that had slightly gone bad. This wasn't just a treat, but it was a way to preserve the sweetness in fresh fruits and vegetables because fresh produce was hard to come by. This marmalade was made by boiling carrots with sugar and a bit of lemon juice, creating a spread that could be used on bread or biscuits. Plus, carrots are packed with nutrition. Carrots are packed with antioxidants like beta-carotene and lutein. These compounds have protective effects against oxidative stress and inflammation. So, despite what you might hear about meatball subs, or what you might even see about them, because let's be honest, we've all seen way too many episodes of Brooklyn 99 where somebody was working a sub, they weren't actually super mainstream. No, they got that reputation in the 60s and 70s, but it was a niche idea and recipe that had pretty much just kept itself to Italian-American communities. It definitely wasn't a local deli item you could expect on every menu, or something that was even a standard. Italian-American communities in cities like Philadelphia and Boston were the first ones who started popularizing this combination. Italian bakeries and delis run by Italian-Americans were one of the first few places that started using homemade meatballs inside of solid sourdough bread, and the idea was beginning to catch on quick. The meatballs were made from a mix of pork, veal, and ground beef, and they were also seasoned with a lot of Parmesan and parsley, but they were slow-cooked in a homemade tomato sauce, which also made them super tender. See, today's subs are different too, because they have all kinds of toppings and melted or shredded mozzarella, but you didn't used to have any of that back then. It wasn't even served on hoagie rolls. Most delis back then kept it on a crusty Italian loaf or a French baguette roll. This was the origin story of meatball subs, as we know them today, you could say. Speaking of food combinations, this next one will definitely blow your mind. Have you ever thought of combining beef with gelatin? If not, this is your sign to twist things up a bit and try this one out. There's a reason why this one was the talk of the town during the dirty 30s. The gelatin was used to thicken soups and stews, while the beef added a hint of protein. Now, since the supply was always limited, don't expect a whole beef steak in your bowl. Just a few chopped up bits and pieces of meat and every few bites was all you got. This meal was designed to be full, and it was left bland for the most part. However, some people in the South decided to spice things up a bit by remixing the recipe according to their likes. One such recipe included canned corned beef, canned peas, gelatin, lemon juice, and vinegar. We wouldn't consider pairing these ingredients today, but it was a lifesaver for those who had to make it through the hard times. Friendly's Watermelon Roll is a unique ice cream dessert shaped like a watermelon slice, with a watermelon-flavored center, lemon-flavored rind, and chocolate chips as seeds. This refreshing treat was introduced by Friendly's in the 1980s and quickly became a favorite summer dessert. It was part of Friendly's seasonal summer menu, which featured other unique frozen treats as well. The ice cream is crafted to resemble a watermelon, with vibrant colors and realistic detailing that make it visually appealing. Friendly's watermelon roll is made from a combination of watermelon and lemon sherbet, creating a light and fruity flavor. The addition of chocolate chips as seeds adds a touch of sweetness and fun to the dessert, enhancing its playful appearance. You go on over to the restaurants in the 50s, especially HTE steakhouses, which our dearly beloved nation is so known for globally. You'll find that wedge salads with blue cheese dressing were almost as addictive as crack in the 50s. The wedge salad became a steakhouse staple, and iceberg lettuce had reigned supreme throughout most of the 50s. The fact that restaurants were now having access to incredibly capable refrigerators was also something that meant iceberg was going to stay top dog for a while. Bottled dressings were also slowly becoming the norm, and Omei cooks made their own by mixing in Hellmann's mayonnaise with some buttermilk and crumbled blue cheese. Then, you threw in bacon and tomatoes into the salad, and all of these home chef recipes were imitations of what you would see at supper clubs and fine dining steakhouses. They would serve these salads with filet mignons, but well, you're not getting that at home. Still, it was an incredible way to spice up that same old meatloaf though, and hey, the blue cheese dressing was nothing to joke about. That thing really had something in it, which I think just died out in the 50s because the way people describe it. Man, I've never had blue cheese like that. Fried pork chops with gravy were one of the most beloved comfort foods of the southern and midwestern regions, and there were more than a few good reasons for that. Some of the biggest ones? That unbeatable mashed potatoes, green beans, and biscuits combination. Plus, it was also just a fun little topic to have banter over. There was a lot of debate between bone-in pork chops and boneless pork chops, and let's just say dinner table conversations around the subject would get heated. Not that this stopped either of the sides from devouring every last pork chop in sight. A very standard 50s-style pork chop had basic seasonings like paprika, garlic salt, pepper and Worcestershire sauce or some dry mustard. Most people would fry it in bacon grease, but some would go for lard because it had a more stronger flavor, and some would pan fry it because they thought, hey, you're already being pretty excessive. The country gravy was a thing of beauty after you fried it. Those little browned bits that would get stuck in the skillet were something people used to turn into a rich gravy using milk and flour or even evaporated milk. Throw in some black pepper and you have a very traditional southern-style gravy, and the cornmeal coating was to die for. It had a very crispy texture, and paired with cornbread, well, you just couldn't beat this. Aunt Jemima frozen pancakes are frozen pancakes that offer a quick and convenient breakfast option, often paired with syrup or fruit. Introduced by Aunt Jemima in the 1970s, these fluffy pancakes were a staple for busy mornings or lazy weekends. Known for their pancake mixes, Aunt Jemima expanded their line to include frozen pancakes to cater to families on the go. The pancakes are made from a classic pancake batter and then frozen to preserve their freshness. They could be heated in the microwave or toaster and were often served with toppings like butter, syrup, or fruit. Aunt Jemima frozen pancakes were particularly popular for their light and fluffy texture, as well as their convenient preparation, making them a beloved breakfast choice that offered a comforting and delicious way to start the day. Eggo waffles are waffles filled with syrup or fruit filling, combining the convenience of a waffle with the indulgence of a filled pastry. These quick and easy breakfast items were introduced by Kellogg's in the early 2000s, offering a unique twist on the classic Eggo waffles. The waffles are made by pressing two waffle halves together with a sweet filling inside. Eggo waffles come in a variety of flavors, including blueberry, strawberry, and maple syrup, providing a range of options to suit different tastes. The filled waffles are cooked until crispy on the outside and soft on the inside. Eggo waffles were often enjoyed as a quick and easy breakfast option, perfect for busy mornings or lazy weekends. Around the later half of the 20th century, there was this big public paranoia that had spread concerning health and the after effects of the way Americans had been eating. Thanks to all that rage, we got dishes like vegetable aspic cups. See, lots of Americans were coming home to an angry mom, a worried wife, or a dad who just kept saying he wouldn't pay for the doctor's fees when your eating habits would eventually circle back around to bite you. It kind of did set fear into people's hearts. especially since the arguments were so convincing. Who could deny that they were eating Kentucky Fried Chicken and McDonald's like addicts back then, or even now? That's why there was this newfound room for fusion food or experimental recipes like vegetable aspic cups. Before, you could tell somebody about vegetables that were set in these tomato-flavored gelatins, and they'd just laugh at you. A chilled salad on top of that? But thanks to how easy convenience food culture had made things, with how you could just buy gelatin and frozen veggies whenever you needed, this was actually a really solid and healthy work lunch option. I'm about to tell you something you never saw coming. See, the funny thing about crab cakes and crab in general is that it actually used to be dirt cheap. Yes, I know the first thing in your head was that how could something like crab meat make its way onto a list for food that would give away the fact your bank is hurting a little? Crab is something people save up for when they want a special occasion, or they have someone special to spend on. It's not something you look at as a snack, meal, or just a casual lunch to go out for. And I think that's the narrative most of us have grown up with. Crab cakes would use mixes of fresh crab, breadcrumbs, and eggs, which would make it a really simple dish all around. The cheapness of crabs couldn't be underestimated, as they were actually around just 35 to 60 cents live weight back then. This was something that came with a catch, though, which I think some of you may have seen coming. See, fresh crab meat would go for that cost, but that was only in coastal areas where crabs were abundant. A reason for the increase in price hikes for crabs is because overfishing also damages their numbers throughout the years, and that overfishing started and sowed its seeds in times like these. Outside of these fishing-reliant areas, fresh crab was still a luxury, one that could easily put you short of a couple of dollars. Crab cakes were something that seafood restaurants and places relied on thoroughly, but it was the Mid-Atlantic where crab cake culture really shined, both with low-key casual and affordable variants and upscale luxurious crab cake-based dishes. So, Swiss steak happened to be one of the first instances of food catfishing that we ever had to deal with. See, despite how the name might make you think that this is an ambassador of the fine land of Switzerland and a hallmark of their culinary culture, it actually has nothing to do with it. Really, it never came from Switzerland, it wasn't some big thing in Swiss communities, it didn't even really use Swiss cheese. The Swiss part of the name basically refers to the way chefs would be tenderizing the cuts of beef that were used for this steak, because being honest with you, those things were thick, tough, and really hard to chew. You had to be pounding the absolute life out of them and braising them in sauces just to get them tender enough to the point where you could respectfully, no, proudly, look someone in the eye and charge $1.75 or something for it. For host chefs, Swiss steaks became something of a lifesaver because they were essentially cheap cuts of beef that could be made, really soft cuts of beef that could then be made into an actual steak. So, hey, who's to judge? If it works, it works. Fish finger sandwiches started off as being wonderful party food and a pretty reasonable meal to go for at diners, but they ended up being something that was also a dish people wanted more of in their daily routines. Some tartar sauce, a fried fish, and 2 slices of bread have never done anyone wrong. It's something you can rely on, and it's a perfect intersection between convenient, unfamiliar, and healthy. Lots of people that were trying to take care of their diet, cut out a bit of their usual sources of protein, and just eat a bit more organic would opt for sandwiches like this. I think if you ever really want to make something pop off in America, you just put it in a sandwich, because that at least guarantees that everyone will try it, Fish finger sandwiches are sometimes a recipe that people say we got from European culture, but it's something I think fishermen have been living off of forever. So not only is this a dish you would see in a tech labyrinth, otherwise known as offices, you would also just see fishermen and dock workers eating these after a hard day's work. It would put some pep in your step, and that's never really something people can have too much of. I think that now sandwiches have become more advanced since accessibility has only gone up with the amount of frozen foods we have now, so these probably have taken a bit of a back seat. One more thing that you would be a fool if you didn't include in your pantry was homemade bread rolls. See, the thing about those survival tricks that people picked up during the Depression was that old habits die pretty hard, especially when they save as much money as these were. Lots of people, even ones who had never even caught a whiff of an oven, began to at least learn how to make their own bread at home during the Depression thanks to how cost-effective it was. I mean, really, how could you compete with it? All you needed back then were leavening and shortening agents, some flour and yeast. And while that was still hard to get, it made people that much more skilled at making do with what they had. This meant that when things did settle down and people got access to actual good ingredients they could use for making homemade bread rolls, they were fantastic at it. Store-bought bread rolls like Parker House just couldn't compete. Plus, it added this touch of care and personalization when you would bake a bread roll for someone for Thanksgiving, you know? Potato salad with mayonnaise was a potluck and picnic classic, and many gatherings like that in the 50s relied on this for being the backbone of the whole thing. Plus, there was some serious divide between what mayonnaise to even use. You might think it's a ridiculous thing to be picky about, but being picky is an understatement. These people were loyal, man. It was like a cult. Home cooks were split between Hellmann's or Miracle Whip, which was Kraft's new Golden Boy that they had spared no expense for marketing. Besides the mayonnaise madness, people got along pretty well on what else to throw in the salad. Some pickle relishes and dill pickles were really economical, and they had a way of spicing up the salad like nothing else. Hard-boiled eggs were something the guys loved a lot, and yellow mustard just had to be there. One of the best parts of a mayonnaise salad was the way you could just serve it chilled. So that meant that after you were done preparing it, you could throw it in the refrigerator and forget about it until you got the message about the potluck at 5 p.m. Saturday. Chicken a la king and puff pastry was another little nugget of French culture and cuisine that served us pretty well. So the idea here this time was to stuff creamy chicken and mushrooms into one single pastry, and there would be lots of these individual pastries, each stuffed to the brim. By now, we're talking about somewhere along the 70s. America's always been a big fan of cream. There's really no denying that, but I would say that we've warmed up to mushrooms a lot more than we used to. I don't think they were not popular, but they weren't exactly a standout ingredient that would be making anyone's top 10 or top 5 either. Americans were changing their palates regarding mushrooms thanks to two things, though. One, they had built up a fondness for it thanks to how many Americans, especially ones living on the edges of urban hubs, relied on foraging wild mushrooms. Two, things like cream soups, such as cream of mushroom soups, were already making the pairing of cream and mushrooms popular. This take on puff pastry wasn't exactly a long shot, since the stage was pretty much mostly set. However, I think most people have opted for things like sandwiches and ordering takeout at lunch now, or just getting a coffee. Work culture's really changed, and having a full-fledged meal during your 15-minute break isn't the most appealing option to a lot of people nowadays. Potato pancakes are one that we are very sad to have seen fade away from the arsenal of home chefs. Pancakes made with matzo or applesauce topped with garlic or fried onions made for such a mouth-watering meal. Low-income households back in those times were struggling to buy produce. Farmers' markets were uniformly unaffordable for middle-income households due to creeping inflation. People needed a vegetable that was cost-appropriate and easy to make in batches. Enter the potato pancake, which revolutionized the breakfast scene in a struggling time. As times improved, people slowly started going to more fancier and creative breakfasts, unfortunately leaving simpler dishes behind. Potato pancakes took a backseat in the face of changing food and economic trends, but anyone from the era will rave to you about the godsend these were. Have you ever wondered how we got to a point where mushrooms became as popular as they are? Stuffed mushrooms in particular were the apple of most people's eyes. A packet of white button mushrooms would run you about 30 cents and keep you satisfied and full for the rest of the evening. The fillings were dirt cheap and probably things you already had on hand in your pantry too. Who doesn't have some breadcrumbs, sausage, basic herbs, and garlic laying around? Plus, mushrooms were largely free for a lot of people. Curious how? During the Depression, people really picked a few survival skills up. One of those happened to be foraging in the wild for fruit and other edible things in the wilderness. People found out that mushrooms were actually one of the greatest gifts nature ever gave us, and they got hooked. Bad. Like, really bad. Mushrooms were seen as an incredibly versatile ingredient. What couldn't you do with these babies? Throw them on pizza, put them in your soup, smash them between a burger, Stir-fry them, roast them, serve them at a cocktail party, or just eat them as they are, or put them in a stew. Do you see where I'm going with this? You can't, because I'm going literally everywhere you can imagine. That's how much you can do with just a simple serving of stuffed mushrooms. French versions were often a lot more buttery, while Italian versions were a lot more prone to being filled with garlic. Either way, what you could say for sure in your life was that this is a dish you really wouldn't regret waiting around for. You know, funnily enough, Swiss cheese was just as popular as ham, and in American delis it was pretty much a staple product. You had a massive overflow of Swiss cheese-based deli sandwiches in places with huge amounts of Swiss immigrant populations like Cincinnati or Milwaukee. Basically, they'd pair it up with corned beef and melt the cheese, and pre-sliced Swiss cheese started to become really available in supermarkets. Kraft and big dairy brands of the same level made it a household name, and advertisers also went pretty hard with their marketing. They wanted to brand Swiss cheese as this new top-tier cheese that wasn't oozing with just flavor. This one had character. I mean, one of the slogans was literally a cheese with personality. And the idea to put holes in it wasn't something the writing room of Tom and Jerry came up with. No, this was something that was a naturally occurring process in Swiss cheese. It was thanks to the carbon dioxide released during fermentation. And then there was also the way fondue sets were beginning to pop off in America during the 50s. Either way, Swiss cheese had a lot of room to make itself cozy in people's home because it was a luxury imported cheese that was priced just right. Flintstones push-up pops are frozen sherbet treats in a tube, featuring characters from the Flintstones on the packaging. These nostalgic treats were introduced in the 1990s by Nestlé, capturing the hearts of children with their fruity and creamy refreshment. The pops are pushed up from the bottom, offering a fun and interactive way to enjoy a cold treat. Flintstones Push Up. Pops come in a variety of fruity flavors such as orange, grape, and cherry, and they are made with a blend of sherbet and ice cream for a smooth and refreshing texture. The sherbet mixture provides a burst of flavor, while the ice cream base offers a creamy finish, creating a delightful contrast. Flintstones Push-Up Pops were often enjoyed as an after-school snack or a summertime refreshment, making them a beloved part of many childhood memories. Speaking of influences from different countries, let's talk about coq au vin. This French dish that's pretty much just chicken, wine, and every root vegetable you could consider fine is actually inexpensive despite hailing from the land of the French. See, whole chickens hadn't gone through the apocalyptic plague we know as post-COVID inflation. Back then, you actually could afford to get a chicken off of your minimum wage, part-time salary. Isn't that insane? Still, I came here to show you different sides of our culinary history, not reminisce about happier times. Speaking of history, the West and East Coasts had different interpretations of this dish. In San Francisco and California in specific, there was a bustling community of French immigrants that had pretty much settled down wonderfully there. Thanks to that, coq au vin was something that spread like wildfire both among the locals and the French restaurants. There was a demand for it like never before. When slow cookers eventually came around and it made cooking this dish 10 times easier, that demand only skyrocketed. Plus, table wine was really cheap. It was just $1 or $3. Can you imagine that? These are prices from just 60 years ago, by the way. It really puts things into perspective, or puts me awfully close to cheap table wine myself. Angel food cake was honestly a lot less complicated. You didn't have to do any fancy wine-based fire bending with the pan here. You just needed egg whites, cake flour, sugar, and vanilla, and a Betty Crocker mix that you knew you could rely on. Nationwide, this was a dish that would be perfect for homemade desserts, birthdays, little ventures into making some money off of your baking, and more. They were particularly popular in diet-conscious neighborhoods, which typically existed in urban hubs because those were the only places where people had the options and accessibility to actually fine-tune their diet, as well as the budget, so think California and New York. This was a really light and airy cake that had just the most subtle amount of vanilla, and that made it enchanting for a lot of people. You couldn't beat how homey and comforting this was, and also, it just looked heavenly, which is why it got the name angel cake. Lettuce cups and shrimp salads were pretty funny. I mean, not exactly funny, but interesting. The assembly was something you would need skill for, though, which isn't at all similar to things like peanut butter and bacon sandwiches or corned beef and cabbage wraps. Leaves had to be carefully plucked from the head of the lettuce, and these would end up forming the shape of the cups. You would then spoon the cups with fillings, which were typically things like spices, vegetables, and stir-fried ground meat, but this instance of the dish has shrimp salad instead. Why was something like this popular? Well, besides a lot of influence from Asian culture, such as Thai and Chinese wraps, they were just easy. I mean, sure, you had to get used to making a lettuce cup, but that wasn't really the hardest thing to do. What was absolutely outstanding about these was the presentation. The sheer visual appeal that this dish had wasn't something you could ever compete with, honestly. I mean, a flowery-looking cup made out of lettuce leaves? That's artistic. Plus, the vibrant and colorful fillings inside would just make it pop off even more. As far as food goes, this one was definitely a slay. Once you did get one made, then you would simply have to prepare it by heating it up. They weren't really as good for lunch at work as they were for finger foods and a pretty-looking side or appetizer at a party, though. Egg drop soup for some royal courts was a show of a chef's skill. In 1930, America, the soup became a beloved soup of the masses who were struggling to make an honest paycheck. Bread from last night and eggs beaten so thoroughly that the preparation itself doubled as a forearm workout resulted in an incredibly rich soup. Sometimes, if a home cook felt particularly fancy, they would have chicken either boiled or shredded in the mix. Using the chicken stock was also a common way to not let anything go to waste, since getting the most bang for your buck out of poultry became a habit of everyone. Most would just have this with eggs and throw in some ginger, chives and olives, or anchovies. We would definitely like to see this make a comeback with a less cost-oriented version that really explores the dish. Now, I don't know if you've ever thought of eating a dandelion fresh from the fields, but our ancestors have done it all for us. Yeah, dandelion salad was a staple during the Dust Bowl era. Since there were no fancy crops to harvest, dandelions had to do the job, and they did it pretty well. People would harvest the dandelion greens and toss them in a salad. Now, I'm not saying it would win any Michelin stars, but hey, it provided some vitamins and roughage, which is more than you can say about canned tumbleweed leaves. To make dandelion salad, the leaves were washed and mixed with whatever other ingredients were available, things like onions, radishes, and even bits of bacon if you were lucky. Believe it or not, this salad was actually tasty, or at least that's what I've heard. I guess we'll have to try it ourselves to know for sure. Fat Frog ice cream bars are whimsical green frog-shaped ice cream bars, typically lime-flavored with gumball eyes. These playful treats were introduced by HB Ice Cream in the 1980s and were popular for their fun appearance and refreshing taste. They were marketed as part of a range of animal-themed ice creams by HB, with other options including fish and dinosaurs. The bars are made from creamy lime-flavored ice cream and have 2 gumballs as eyes, which add a fun element for kids to enjoy. Fat Frog ice cream bars were often found in ice cream trucks and at convenience stores. These bars were enjoyed as a refreshing treat on summer days or as a playful snack at parties, providing a burst of citrus flavor and a smile for those who enjoyed them. Broiled fish with lemon butter wasn't just one of the most economical and affordable things you could have. It was also one of the healthiest and most delicious ones. Food like this proved that if you wanted to take care of your body, you didn't have to sacrifice every last bit of fun in your life to do it. A healthy and light alternative in an era where fried food and fast food chains were pretty much dominating. Broiled fish and lemon butter came onto the American food scene with a statement to make and a lot of grit. Whitefish was what people typically preferred, like your usual flounder, cod, haddocks, soles. Pretty much typical stuff you find swimming in American waters. You really couldn't have a recipe about broiled fish that didn't involve fresh lemon wedges, though, or at least some lemon juice. It was like this unspoken oath between cookbook authors, chefs, and magazine editors alike to simply not ever exclude lemon wedges. Maybe people in creative jobs really love it? I mean, hey, I don't. But enough about me, let's talk about why broiled fish was such a competitive alternative in an era that was pretty much headed the opposite way. The thing about this recipe is that it's so tied to the process of fishing and catching your own food and a lot of the people that lived in coastal cities and had fishing as a trade would lead really active lifestyles. They were pretty against the wave of fatty, greasy fried food that was taking over, and you'll see a lot more about that in some of other videos about the 90s. Now, bacon grease might seem like a strange thing to highlight, but hear me out. In a time when oil was scarce, bacon grease was like liquid gold. It was used for everything from frying potatoes to greasing pans. And let's be honest, it adds a flavor boost to just about anything. Can you imagine making biscuits with bacon grease? Oh, it was good. Bacon was one of the few adorable meats during this time, and it left behind grease, which was way too good to just toss out. Now, I know this bad boy has no nutritional value, but sometimes all you need is a little flavor in your life, and it's fine to have cheat days sometimes, right? So, while it might not be the healthiest option, it certainly helped to make those Dust Bowl meals a little more enjoyable. Mildred Armstrong Kalish lived in Iowa during the Great Depression. She recalls cooking with bacon grease, which she called her family's Tuscan olive oil. So, Bologna and cheese stackers were pretty much the ideal American breakfast, something that carried the spirit of our nation as well as all the flavors we've grown to love. Sliced Bologna would be layered with cheese from the finest wheels in all of the United States of America. It would be packed in wax paper too, which was a funny little trick, but I'll explain why it was so popular. See, the thing about wax paper is that it traps moisture and flavor in, and that means your stackers stay perfectly fine just the way they were after you first made them. Bologna was always something we've had a deep appreciation for, and this stacker variant just proved that no matter how much the landscape of American cuisine changes, some habits die hard, and some just don't die at all. Not only was it just a good thing to eat before or after work, it was the perfect lunch to carry in a box with you. Plus, by the end of the 20th century, most offices had microwaves too, and you could always just find slices of bologna for cheap at most convenience stores. It was this kind of low-effort, easy-to-source and assemble style of cooking that would overtake America soon enough, and I think that's a part of why a lot of us prefer a latte instead of a sandwich now, ironically enough. Cold pork pie was weird. It was supposed to be this British savory pastry that was probably the only dish best served cold after revenge, but I think it fell short on a lot of fronts. First, let's start with what constitutes a cold pork pie. This frigidly cold piece of British culture comes fully equipped with American favorites like lard, chopped or ground pork, nutmeg, mace, and lots of other stuffings. Plus, you know how people start experimenting with food and adding their own twists and turns wherever they can, no matter what. Who really sticks to tradition when you have like 5 different kinds of cheese to try? Anyway, while all of that sounds pretty good, fun, and a perfect environment for some serious brainstorming with what you can do with a pork pie, it was the savory jelly and cold aspect of it that kind of didn't stick too well. After the baking, you were supposed to pour a savory jelly made out of pork stock into the pie through a pretty tiny hole in the crust. Once the jelly would set and cool, it would enrich the flavor of the pie even more and help to preserve the meat as well. Pork pies were, for this reason, always served cold. However, America is a place that's really used to having their pork pies hot. And as you can probably tell, that's why you don't see bakeries, homes, or offices having cold pork pie days anymore. On the other hand, Bananas Foster was a dessert that was very, very cheap. Man, I can't even tell you how many kids would die for this. It would be a non-stop pity party of how nothing good ever happened to them and how they really, really want a Banana Foster. They'd do the dishes, they'd promise to do all the chores, get their homework done by 7, eat some broccoli, not go out, get in bed by 9, and just be the spitting image of a model child, all for a serving of Foster. Why was it so good? Well, you tell me what happens when you put butter, brown sugar, vanilla ice cream, and more cinnamon than is probably safe for a kid or anyone really in one place. Now, of course, Bananas Foster does involve rum, and when serving it to children, that was an aspect of the dish people chose to exclude. But when the dinner table was above 18, oh boy, both bananas and bottles of rum would finish, and that was something you could come to expect like clockwork. This was actually something that was made in Brennan's restaurant in New Orleans around 1951, but it didn't get as popular as it is in this description until later on into the 60s. especially in highly metropolitan areas. Care Bears waffles are whimsical waffles shaped like Care Bears characters, offering a fun and playful breakfast option for kids. These colorful waffles were introduced in the 1980s, becoming a popular choice for families looking to add a bit of joy to their morning routine. They were inspired by the Care Bears franchise, which was a beloved children's brand during the 1980s and 1990s. The waffles are typically made from a classic waffle batter, cooked in a waffle iron with Care Bears molds, and then served with toppings like syrup or fruit. The waffles could be customized with various toppings, such as whipped cream, chocolate chips, or sprinkles, allowing for a creative and interactive meal. So, cranberry salad was such a massive holiday staple, and luckily, this is one thing that has always been consistent throughout American history. Cranberry salad is essentially an incredibly big necessity at these Thanksgiving dinners. It's like you just can't cut the turkey without it, you know? The way you don't ever eat the first slice of cake until the birthday person comes in. Plus, it really didn't help that this dish just naturally went so well with roast turkey, baked ham, and other kinds of holiday classics. Many versions of a classic 50s take on a cranberry salad included incredible amounts of gelatin. This was always raspberry or cherry flavored, but the idea was to mix it in with fresh cranberries and crush it with pineapple. Then, hand-crank grinders were really common before we ever got to having food processors. Homemakers would use them to chop cranberries and oranges together and basically make a delightful little cranberry relish. You could serve it in molds, you could serve it in different styles of salads, it could go with ham, it elevated turkeys. It was one of the few things that natively grew in the country. I mean, it was a miracle worker for such a simple salad. The Klondike Choco Taco is a one-of-a-kind ice cream treat shaped like a taco. This inventive dessert features a waffle cone shell filled with vanilla ice cream and fudge. Introduced in 1984 by the Jack and Jill Ice Cream Company, the Choco Taco gained popularity for its innovative design and delicious taste. The dessert was inspired by traditional Mexican tacos, blending the concept with the classic ice cream cone. The waffle shell provides a crispy contrast to the creamy ice cream, while the chocolate coating adds a layer of sweetness. The Choco Taco was made by folding a waffle into a taco shape, filling it with ice cream and fudge, then dipping it in chocolate and sprinkling it with peanuts. The Choco Taco was a favorite at ice cream trucks and convenience stores, enjoyed by kids and adults alike. Let's talk about an undisputed heavyweight champion. Let's talk about the Michael Jordan of Sunday dinners. See, you wake up on Sunday, and besides that initial sinking Sunday feeling, you wake up with a lot of hope. The hope that you'll wake, step out, and smell roast chicken with gravy being cooked up in the kitchen. It was a special occasion meal too, but it was something that moms always kept tucked away in their cooking revolver for Sunday, making sure to not make it any day prior. It made the whole thing a family tradition, but you could do that with most dishes if you tied them to a specific day. Bit like Pavlov, isn't it? This one was special purely because of its homeliness and quality. For a long while, it was something that was simple, yet irreplaceable. People thought this was the ultimate Sunday dinner, and it was the golden standard of American food. Simple, a well-balanced and nutritionally sound plate, and easy to eat. It made you tougher, it didn't hurt your wallet, and it tasted amazing. So a lot of people honestly just thought that there was nothing better to make. Beef roasts were popular too, but nothing beat chicken. Also, people had beef for their grilling sessions, so there was that. Morton pot pies are frozen pot pies with flaky crusts and savory fillings, such as chicken or beef with vegetables. These classic comfort foods were introduced by Morton Frozen Foods in the 1940s, offering a hearty meal in a single dish. The pies feature a golden, buttery crust that encases a rich and flavorful filling. Morton pot pies were particularly popular for their convenience and taste, providing a meal that could be enjoyed at home or on the go. The pies were traditionally baked in the oven, allowing the crust to become crispy and golden, while the filling remained hot and savory. Morton pot pies were often enjoyed as a comforting dinner or a quick lunch, offering a delicious and filling option for any time of day. Dandelion salad might sound like a fairy tale-like name for an incredibly frugal but delicious meal. By now, You might have noticed the scavenger vibe in terms of ingredients of the dishes so far. People making anything out of whatever they had on hand. Economic downturns often feature lifestyle changes, and the Great Depression was no other, sending people on a scramble to find and eat anything. Dandelion salad took scramble seriously as the meal involved finding and foraging dandelions. You would cut out all the roots, flowers, and waste to make the dressing for a very healthy salad. For people, especially those on a diet and a budget, this was a godsend. For a garnish, all people would usually put on it was lemon juice and olive oil, a dash of salt, and you were good to go at basically no cost. Ploughman's lunch was this really traditional British cold meal, and I guess you'll find a lot of these on the list. The basic combo here was basically just bread, some pickles, chutneys, apples, and cheese. You'd also get chutneys, which I'm not sure what that's worth. The British never really made good ones anyway. Hey, I'm only kidding. It's quintessentially a European breakfast though, and over there it's even considered rustic, but over here, just like the previous item, this was considered pretty controversial. Now, most of the setup here was something any pure-blooded American could work with. You have your farmhouse loaves, some sourdough if that's not your type, or even multi-grain bread. We've eaten Subway on hungrier days with those same options, right? It was just the cold meat part that wouldn't vibe well with a lot of people. I mean, really though, what do you expect? This is the land of cookouts with grills, deep-fried chicken fillets, and melted gooey cheese on just about everything. Cold just doesn't fit anywhere in that picture. So if you really want to talk about something that made waves, was new, and something that got a warm welcome from everyone, you gotta mention chicken Cordon Bleu in the 50s. While it wasn't a household dish like meatloaves were, it was definitely beginning to pick up a fair amount of steam in upscale dining establishments and gourmet culinary circles. When people heard Cordon Bleu, their minds conjured up images of high-end French restaurants with fancy, slow, melodious orchestral music and the finest wine you can imagine. This dish, which was breaded chicken stuffed with ham and cheese, wasn't exactly that extravagant, but it was a new and fun idea. And most importantly, the biggest thing about it was just that the kids loved it. Seriously, whether it's the 50s or 2025, if you're a middle-class family with kids, you just know that you have to schedule the entire day's menu around them and only them. You could also substitute most of the stuff restaurants used with things like Kraft Swiss cheese and canned ham for the stuffing, and well, breading the chicken was never really that much work. JellO's pizza rolls are bite-sized turnovers filled with pizza ingredients, such as cheese, tomato sauce, and toppings. The original recipe, created by Geno Palucci in the late 1960s, was known for its distinct flavor and crispy texture. Palucci was inspired to create the rolls after noticing the popularity of frozen snacks, and his Italian heritage influenced the flavors. The rolls are made by wrapping a thin dough around a savory filling, then baking or frying until golden and crispy. The original recipe included a blend of cheeses, tomato sauce, and spices, creating a rich and satisfying taste. The rolls can be customized with various fillings such as pepperoni or sausage to suit different preferences. JellO's pizza rolls offer a quick and delicious way to enjoy pizza flavors in a portable format, making them a popular snack or party food. Now, as far as cold and chilled dishes go, a salad is something people can cope with, but cold roasted beef with horseradish sauce? By God, it's almost blasphemy. Really? Cold beef? You ever heard of that? It was a shock to me too. I think most of us have just grown up assuming all meat-related dishes are supposed to be served hot by default, you know? It was these thin slices of roast beef that were packed in a dipping sauce, but it was still something to get used to. Now, I'm not really sure what the idea was behind this. I guess it is true that microwaves weren't exactly a function of everyone's homes, and lots of sandwiches would just go cold. If you eat enough of those, it can definitely develop into like a habit, but to have this as a preference? Chat, I'm just not sure how I feel about this one. What would you guys think? If you give it a yes, I'm taking this to work tomorrow, so just think with caution, okay? That lunch break is really important. Baked ziti couldn't land further on the opposite side of the spectrum. So far, this is our most expensive item yet. The cheese for this bad boy would run you around 50 to 70 cents easily, and that was a price you could expect in most markets and grocery stores. The canned tomato sauce was the cheapest, since it would basically just be for $12 or $14, and the pasta itself was around $15. Naturally, in places with a heavy concentration of Italian-American populations across the suburbs and neighborhoods, this dish was a regular hit. Northeast, you had Connecticut and New York making new strides with how well Americans understood pasta. In the Midwest, traditional forms of authentic Italian dishes and recipes were being preserved by immigrants that had a knack for tradition. This rich and cheesy dish might taste just a bit different depending on where you find yourself landing, but it's something worth trying in whatever area of the United States you find yourself in. The pasta and tomato sauce were cheap, and since it was cheesy, it didn't have a lot going on. People saw it as a dish that was okay for your casual lunch or dinner, especially on a budget. Swedish meatballs were affordable, easy to make, and really just the perfect thing for entertaining a crowd. They became popular as a part of party culture, which was something that the 70s were known for, but it was something that had been bubbling well before that, in the 60s. Also, canned and powdered mixes of gravy were something that made the meatball preparation process infinitely easier. Ground beef here was also costing around 50 cents a pound, or at best 70, and pantry regulars like allspice and nutmeg or eggs were really common ingredients. Overall, it wasn't hard to make this dish, but it was hard to make it again and again. The demand for these meatballs was crazy. The simple truth is that Americans were bored of what they were eating. They had all the meatloafs and meatballs you could think of, and if they were going to have it again, they wanted it in a new and refreshing way. The answer to this dilemma was to take other cultures' ideas on meatballs, and that's how we got here. So, like I was just telling you, Spam used to be the next big thing, and for good reason too. We had things like Spam and cheese roll-ups. A typical 70s office lunch would look like slices of Spam that had been rolled up with mustard and cheese. Now, these could either be grilled to enhance the smokiness of the Spam and make it contrast nicer with the pineapple, or you could bake it so that the cheese would melt and the mustard would mix in with it better for an overall more well-rounded flavor. All things considered, this was on the right track. It was quick, it was tasty, it was healthy, and it was also what people needed during a time where re-entering the workforce was really hard and put a lot of people out of their usual routines. The thing is, America is known for fickle trends. We'll like something one day, swear by it the next, and forget it halfway into the night. Spam and cheese roll-ups were good, but they took a sideline and started being party food more than a work lunch. Oatmeal cakes are a warm, fuzzy childhood dish that many might associate with visits to their grandparents. Failing economy on one side, and grandma spoiling her favorite niece and nephew on the other. You just know they will always find a way, and lucky enough for us that the people of the times did it so craftily. In 35 minutes, you had a wondrous dessert to yourself that was quick enough to make after long, panic-filled days. Canned oatmeal on a soft cake glazed with an almond or peanut topping really set hearts on fire. Despite the cake's popularity back then, especially in the fitness and health community, it still did not stand the test of the time. Of course, it is a great way to spice up your oatmeal, regardless of how other breakfasts prepared with more culinary liberties taken would eventually replace it. Stauffer's Welsh Rarebit is a frozen version of the classic Welsh dish, consisting of a cheese sauce poured over toasted bread. This rich and savory dish was introduced by Stauffer's in the mid-20th century, providing a quick and indulgent meal option for cheese lovers. The dish is a take on a traditional Welsh recipe that dates back to the 18th century, known for its comforting blend of cheese and bread. It's made from a blend of cheese, butter, cream, and seasonings, creating a smooth and flavorful sauce that is poured over slices of toasted bread. The dish is typically prepared in the oven or microwave, allowing for easy preparation and serving. Stauffer's Welsh Rarebit is often enjoyed as a lunch or dinner entree, offering a comforting and hearty option that pairs well with a variety of sides, such as salad or vegetables. Macaroni salad with ham cubes is a really nostalgic one. If you look at it from the lens of what was popular in the era at the time, Then yeah, sure, macaroni salads were a perfect middle ground between healthier, leaner bowls of salads and the typical macaroni and cheese meals we were all used to. People thought they had to get started somewhere, and well, why not get it going with something you know you can stand? If you look at it historically, then macaroni salad actually goes all the way back to European dishes like pasta fredda, and in the early 20th century, let's say around the 20s and 30s, it was a really popular meal to have as a side dish. During the Depression, it became a staple because you could make so much of it in large batches and still get everyone fed and taken care of. Now, in the war era, the rise of convenience foods meant that mayonnaise and macaroni were getting even more popular and accessible than ever before. It was only natural that people would start adopting macaroni salads, but they needed something to go with it. Some oomph, you know? That definitely came from the smokiness of the ham cubes, which honestly bounced really well off of the macaroni. This salad was a typical lunch in factories, offices, and just about any kind of labor-intensive job you could imagine. It's just a bit sad that people have gone back to Kraft's mac and cheese boxes now, though. Cheese balls with crackers were some of the most affordable things you could buy as a middle-class family in the 1960s. They were pretty much just for 50 to 55 cents, and Triscuits and Ritz were some brands that no household could really live without. These were pretty much the dominant cracker brands in the country, and this was a dish that was enjoyed essentially all throughout the nation. Especially in places like California and New York, where TV culture was fast approaching and people were more and more inclined towards easy-to-handle, prepare, and eat dishes like this. Plus, who could contest how good of a comfort food this was? It was super convenient on all fronts. It had cheese and it had a crunchy kick thanks to the crackers. I don't know about you, but to me, that's pretty much as American as it gets, really. Cool Whip pie is a simple and creamy dessert made with a Cool Whip, filling in a graham cracker crust, often topped with fruit or chocolate. This easy-to-make pie became popular in the late 20th century thanks to its simplicity and delightful taste. The pie is typically made by mixing Cool Whip with ingredients like cream cheese or pudding mix, spreading it into a pre-made graham cracker crust, and then chilling it until set. The versatility of the Cool Whip filling allows for a variety of flavors, such as chocolate, peanut butter, or fruit. The pie is often topped with fresh fruit, chocolate shavings, or nuts, enhancing its flavor and visual appeal. Cool Whip pie is a favorite for gatherings or potlucks, providing a light and refreshing dessert option that is easy to prepare and enjoy. The creamy filling and crunchy crust create a satisfying contrast, making Cool Whip pie a delightful treat that is perfect for any occasion. Another fact you may not know about a food you probably know all too well is turkey stuffing. Now, this stuff wasn't just for Thanksgiving, it was also made to go along with pork chips, stuffed fish, and chicken, too. The idea was the same as what you would do with a turkey. People back then just looked at it and thought, if you can do it to that bird, why can't you do it to this one? Or a cow? Or a fish? Also, unlike a lot of the other dishes that are on the list so far, there was really no over-reliance on canned goods or processed food. There was no good substitute for homemade turkey stuffings, although that does exist now. Back then, people had to do it the old-fashioned way. So I guess if your idea of a Sunday is putting on some indie pop and getting to work in the kitchen, then yeah, this is for you. Homemade turkey stuffings typically used stale bread or cornbread and crackers that had been mixed in with a broth with onions and celery plus some butter in it. Those ready-made turkey stuffings I was talking about? They were a thing in 1972. So for a good 22 years, people relied heavily on saltines and Ritz crackers for the ideal stuffing. Homemade Hungry Man dinners are hearty frozen meals designed for big appetites, often featuring meats like turkey or fried chicken with sides like mashed potatoes and corn. These early versions were introduced by Swanson in 1973, aiming to provide a larger portion size than traditional TV dinners. The meals were known for their generous portions and satisfying flavors, making them popular among those with hearty appetites. The original Hungry Man dinners offered a variety of entree options, including Salisbury steak, meatloaf, and pork chops, paired with classic comfort food sides like green beans, mac and cheese, and stuffing. The meals were cooked and served in aluminum trays, allowing for easy preparation and cleanup. The substantial portions and satisfying flavors made Hungry Man dinners a go-to choice for those seeking a comforting and filling meal. On the other hand, stuffed bell peppers were an American classic, especially in places like the South. The idea was really similar to the egg-stuffed salad tomatoes I was talking about. Even then, I told you how it's more or less like these bell peppers. The idea here this time was to hollow these peppers out and fill them in with things like rice, tomato sauce, and ground meat. They were also the perfect thing to take to work because you could carry them in just about anything. The more transportable something was, the better it would function as a work lunch. Stuffed bell peppers also had the extra effect of giving you a boost of energy, which was always really nice because desk jobs, as I'm sure all of you might be familiar with, can suck the soul out of you. The reason these were popular in the South is because it's arguably the home of stuffed peppers and all variants of them. Those people love their spice, man. Creamed chipped beef on toast, however, was a more happening kind of toast-based breakfast. Particularly fancy and skillful home cooks would smoke the meat sometimes to add a better BBQ flavor. Thin slices of beef in glass jars were all you needed, which were not too expensive, and the rest of the dish was completed with a creamy, thick white sauce. Meat lovers would use cayenne pepper, remembering days where they could spray it on their steaks instead of their toast. Comfort food was really lacking in the Depression times because most could not make theirs. Creamed chipped beef on toast was a wonderful replacement that we are still sad to see fade away to history. Depending on where you were, the dish was more rare because you would most often see it in middle to upper middle class households. Beef really was expensive back then, but nowadays lots of other beef-based breakfasts took its spot. Cobb salad, on the other hand, was America's attempt at finally trying to eat healthy while being on a budget. Lettuce, eggs, tomatoes, and cheese were things that were so widely available that it was a wonder if someone even had to go out shopping for this list of ingredients. People were also trying their hardest to cut down on their meat consumption, but that just wasn't happening as ideally as vegetarians and health nuts had hoped for. Nobody could escape the call of bacon, and Cobb salad wasn't an exception. Still, it's not like people had no impulse control. They would throw in chicken and turkey in there for the sake of having some good protein. It wasn't something you would just make at your home. You could even go to steakhouses and local diners for this. It was a dish that was perfect for casual dining. Also, by the 60s, lots of people were returning to the workforce, and for the first time, that also included droves of women. Cobb salad became synonymous with ladies who lunch and was seen as a casual mid-shift option to go for. Honestly, it's the exact same situation with casseroles like baked pork chops, which were most commonly prepared with canned soups like Campbell's cream of mushroom or cream of celery soup. This was supposed to be a one-dish meal. I mean, look, I know you've heard all about how the 60s were casserole central, and none of that information is wrong. It really was a period of time where casseroles were the apex predator. But they're the ones getting eaten, so let's just go with apex prey. You get the point. Anyway, casseroles like baked pork chops would use seasoned flour or crushed crackers as a coating before they went to the baking, and Ritz cracker crumbs were one of the best ways to do it. Then, you also had fruits being included into the recipes, which a lot of people were initially against, but when recipes like Betty Crocker and Better Homes and Gardens started putting them on the front pages, a lot of people got a much more open perspective on their usage. There was a saying that apples and pork go together, and a lot of recipes proved that true with how well they made applesauce and baked apples work with the dish, and all of this was on a budget too. When you think of popcorn, the Dust Bowl era is probably the last thing that comes to mind. Popcorn is the comfort food of the movie theaters, but believe it or not, they were still all the rage back in the 30s when options were limited. During the Dust Bowl, these crunchy snacks took on a whole new role. Yes, they paired popcorn with milk back then, and it became the combo of our dreams. When milk was available, it was poured over freshly popped popcorn to turn the snack into a whole meal. Milk was scarce, so it wasn't always available, but when it was, this meal was everyone's go-to. Popcorn was a cheap and easily accessible grain, and milk, if you were lucky enough to have some, added a bit of protein and calcium. It might not be your first choice for a fancy dinner, but it was a clever way to make do with what was available. Funny Feet ice cream is an ice cream treat shaped like a foot, typically strawberry-flavored with a bubblegum toe. This quirky dessert was introduced in the 1980s by Walls, capturing the imagination of children with its unusual shape and playful presentation. Walls strategically positioned this product during a time when novelty ice creams were becoming increasingly popular, aiming to capture a significant share of the market with its innovative design. The ice cream is made from creamy, strawberry-flavored ice cream, molded into the shape of a foot, and topped with a small piece of bubblegum as the big toe. Funny feat. Ice cream was often enjoyed as a summertime snack or a special treat, providing a playful and refreshing way to cool down. So you might notice that this issue where you need a lot of prep work for these dishes isn't exactly a unique one. Lots of dishes share it, and even cottage cheese and pineapple bowls have the same problem. Now, this dish was something that came out around the 60s and 70s, when Americans were really into trying out new things. One of the first things they opted for was pineapple, and this was thanks to Spam, which really made the American population warm up to an otherwise chronically detested fruit. This bowl was seen as healthy, full of protein, it was cold, and it could be prepared way ahead of time. The reason this lasted as long as it did was probably because of that, though only people that were super serious about their health and diet would be bringing this kind of stuff to the office. It wouldn't make sense to ignore the perfectly convenient, cheap, and delicious deli food on the corner of your office and go for a cottage cheese and pineapple bowl. Unfortunately, while this one has the convenience factor down, it couldn't last in the long haul because tastes have just changed too much from the days where bowls like this could work. Ham and scalloped potatoes in the 50s were a way for leftover ham to get out of your refrigerator and into your system, just like you paid for. They were also one of the best Sunday inners you could have, and they were a pretty popular choice for potlucks, just the kind that were in churches. Man, I can't begin to describe to you the absolute convenience that canned food brought along with it. Then you'll say that, oh, but canned food has been around since like the 19th century. Sure, but has mass-produced canned food available in every supermarket, grocery store, and mom and pop joint around the corner been a thing? No, right? That was the real shakeup. It basically meant that you had access to things like cream of mushroom soup on the get-go or scalloped potatoes, and then terre was the way people were making the switch to electric ovens. All of this together meant that layered dishes that took a while to make like ham and scalloped potatoes were a lot easier to handle. It wasn't as much of a fuss anymore to layer everything up, and hey, you'd be pretty popular at the potluck if you showed up with this. Kid Cuisine is a line of frozen meals for children, often featuring cartoon characters on the packaging. Introduced in 1989 by Conagra Foods, these meals provided a balanced, kid-friendly dinner with fun sides like corn or mac and cheese. The meals typically include an entree, a side, a dessert, and sometimes a small toy or game on the packaging, engaging children beyond just the meal. Kid Cuisine offers a variety of options, such as chicken nuggets, mini corn dogs, and pizza, appealing to children's tastes. Kid Cuisine meals are microwavable and easy to prepare, making them a convenient option for busy families. The inclusion of a dessert, such as a brownie or pudding, adds to the appeal of these meals. The variety of options also meant that there was something for every child's taste. Now, this might be an odd pairing to a lot of you, but peanut butter and bacon sandwiches really did hit. Hey, some of you who are 90s kids might even remember. This was basically one of the best lunches you could get, and to be honest, I still think a lot of people do make this even if it's not as popular as it used to be. It was just a flawless idea in concept and execution. Take 2 slices of bread, a dash of peanut butter, and some perfectly well-fried strips of bacon. It's genius. Throw in some iceberg mayo and whatever else it is you like and whatever keeps you going throughout that miserable shift, and you have yourself a full-sized snack and meal. This was basically the reason why this dish got so popular. You could even make 2 of these and still make your daily subway or bus ride if you were living in crowded urban centers. Plus, there was just so much room for variety with a dish like this that a lot of people didn't see the point in changing it up. However, that coffee work culture thing I was talking about is unfortunately a real phenomenon. Somewhere along the line, people really started to abandon the idea of having a solid meal at all for lunch And I think you only see older workers who were raised in the 20th century still having things like this. Let's try to keep it moving. Now, you've heard me repeat how lamb and beef were a lot more expensive than pork, and that's doubly true for lamb chops. These actually are the first item here we have, besides maybe a very flashy version of baked ziti, that crosses $1, totaling for around $1.29. These chops were not the same price as your knockout cuts of steak that would get all the rich folks spreading their wallets and purses, but it would still get a lot of traction. See, in the 60s, American culture was in a cocoon-like phase. It was changing, crumbling, adapting, and being inspired by all the different communities that existed in the country. By all accounts, it had become a melting pot. A pot where flavors and ideas of the entire world came together to stew, simmer, and eventually become something wildly different. How does this tie back into lamb chops? Depending on the area you were in or the community, you could have pork chops that were done in the style of Greek cuisine or Scandinavian cuisine, or even Eastern European takes on lambs. Some people would season it with garlic, whereas others would go for things like rosemary or mint. People would broil their chops, pan-sear them, and even grill and roast them. Like I said, it was a melting pot, and you had at least 10 different ways of trying lamb chops before you could say you had seen it all. Bean soup is different from the other soups on our list because, in contrast, bean soup was pretty simple to make. Dried red kidney beans in a thick soup made for a favorite of states like Idaho, where the dish originated from. You could find different ideas on the soup from house to house, as some had their vegetables as toppings and others had meats. Fred Dubois, who was Idaho's senator at one point, passed a bill that mandated the Senate restaurant to have bean soup on the menu every day. Definitely one way to start a movement if you ask us, but the trend definitely stuck around after it gained steam. It was an amazing way for low-income neighborhoods to eat healthy, but nowadays you would not find it in households as beans are not really the go-to item for soups. Cornbread was one of the most popular sources of carbohydrates back in the day. Since there wasn't much food available, this one was a reliable provider of instant energy and kept folks fueled through the toughest days. Cornbread was versatile too. It could be served with just about anything, from a hearty bean soup to a simple stew. It was the kind of bread that could stand up to the most basic of meals and still make them feel a bit more complete. Plus, it was easy to make in large batches, which was a huge plus when feeding a family when pockets were tight. This was a staple during the Dust Bowl because cornmeal was cheap and filling. You could whip up a simple cornbread loaf, fry up corn fritters, or even make mush. Now, pork roast with apples AW is one of the most classic fall dishes you could have, and I know we did go over this a while back too, but that was like saying I show speed can run. I mean, I'm not lying, but that's not really the whole truth either, is it? Pork roast with apples was a cool weather meal that was pretty much always perfect for fall and winter, and those were always seasons where you wanted to be budgeting extra tight because between all the babies made in February, holidays, celebrations, and potlucks, well, let's just say there's not a lot of room left in your paycheck for anything else. Pork roasts with apples were a cheap and convenient way for families to have an incredible meal. All you needed to do was be on point with your seasonings and sides. Most people kept it safe and simple, just throwing in mashed or scalloped potatoes or some green beans. It was a dish that would work on the table as a Thanksgiving course, or it was a dish that could last the family a couple of days. Either way, it was one of those pairings you think shouldn't work, but works a little too well. To be honest, same deal with corned beef and cabbage wraps. The thing with sandwiches is that, as good as they were, most people really were trying to get onto that health parade that was taking over. It wasn't just a trend or a niche movement you'd only find in states that voted blue. It was something even the anti-vaxxers were getting behind. And if you can get those people to think about their health, we're either at rock bottom or approaching it. Corned beef and cabbage wraps were supposed to be familiar ground, while also being healthy enough that you could eat them every day. Plus, lots of people had grown pretty accustomed to eating cabbage thanks to victory gardens, which were just makeshift gardens you would have in your backyard during the Depression and grow crops out of. These were actually really good too, and with canned corned beef becoming a widespread item in most stores, it was only easier to make at home. Even someone who couldn't cook could just make and assemble this on their own. Honestly, there isn't an extreme amount of things you can do with a meatloaf. Sometimes, and I mean this from the best place possible, they just get old. Look, I'm a fan of my mom's meatloaf just like you are, and sure, I'd take it over a lot of other things, especially if I had a nasty hankering for comfort food, but it's just been overdone. What people used to do to cope with the fact that nothing they could do with their meatloaf, no mushroom sauce, no Dijon mustard or whatever could work, they would just throw some ketchup on it. Yup. It's the equivalent of boiling up some cup noodles and then an egg, throwing it together and pretending like you're in an episode of Naruto. It's just the most convenient thing people could do to get the most bang out of their buck. I mean, what would you prefer? Making an elaborate side, topping, sauce, and everything for a meatloaf you've had 1,000 times over? Or just turning the television on, sorry Kendrick, and relaxing with some easily available ketchup? Prune pudding was one of the more niche dishes that were created during the Great Depression. What really was surprising was that prune pudding extended to the upper royalty as well, since even prominent VIPs would also be real low budget with how they eat. Prune pudding became very popular as a result of the efforts made by First Lady Eleanor Roosevelt, who would serve prune pudding at White House functions. It stained the White House's culinary track record, sure, but earned massive points with the struggling American people. For being made of such a simple ingredient and some syrups of your choice, it was definitely one of the tastiest and cheapest meals to come home to. Cold fried chicken wasn't exactly what the name makes it sound like. You can't really cold fry something, obviously, but what you can do is serve fried chicken that's been chilled, or fried chicken that's at least at room temperature. See, this was something that got popular at picnics, and it was a way for people to get rid of leftovers when they didn't have microwaves. As you might know, fried chicken tends to lose a lot of its charm when you just warm it up on a pan and stove. Now, I'm no one to judge, but that's just not how you do it. Naturally, though, if you don't have a microwave, that's where your head would go, and a lot of people just didn't back then. So, what's the next step? Do we bite the bullet and eat that delicious fried chicken cold or at room temperature? Or do we warm it up and lose a lot of the bang for buck value that comes with a 3-piece combo for like $2 or $3? Most people stuck with the first option. Cold fried chicken would also be good as a work lunch because it was an easy way to get rid of your leftovers if you didn't feel like eating it at home, plus it was super quick. Just grab the fried chicken, box it, and go. You had your work lunch for that day sorted. It caught on a lot more than you'd think, really. Fruit gelatin salad with cream cheese was something that was one of the most popular desserts back then in the 1960s. JellO cheap was cheap, really cheap, and it was around 10 to 15 cents per box. The canned fruit here was also wildly inexpensive and something you could find just about anywhere in the American states, really. Now, the most common toppings for fruit gelatin salads were whipped cream, some marshmallows, or cottage cream cheese. This was something that the American suburbia most of all loved more than anyone else. Potlucks, cocktail parties, and a lot more would serve these as regularly as they could. The salad was sweet, it was fruity, it was filled with all kinds of good vitamins and health benefits, and it was something that would get your nagging parents off of your back. Now you could call them and show them that you actually were taking your gut health seriously. As far as the flavor went for this dish, it really could have been anything depending on the kind of fruits you were using. Most people would typically just use pantry staples that they always have worked with and have lying around. It made things easier that way and gave them a lot of familiar options to experiment with before they found out what kind of JellO worked best for them. Still, there's a massive difference between beef, pork, and frog legs, which despite being only 25 to 40 cents and in some areas completely free if you caught them yourselves, were very unnerving meals. I mean, I think I speak for a lot of us when I say that there is a line in the sand we all draw somewhere, and frog legs are definitely crossing it. It was popular in places like Mississippi, Louisiana, and Arkansas, especially because of influences from Cajun cuisine and Creole cooking techniques. In the Midwest, though, they'd take a pretty extra spin on this. Personally, I think frying frog legs in beer batter is taking it a few steps too far, but whatever works for you. This was a dead giveaway that you were middle class, though. Despite how it was only served rarely in homes, even the ones that had a taste for it, despite how it was even featured in restaurant menus, It was always something people saw as a dish you had to settle for to eat. It wasn't as common as your other meat alternatives, and it was nowhere near as popular or as varied either. Turkey and cranberry sandwiches are a bit of a hit or miss depending on the kind of stuff you prefer, but throughout Thanksgiving, you'd basically see people bringing nothing else but this. Why? Well, I know that you all know cranberries and cranberry jams, sauces, and desserts get really popular around Thanksgiving, but have you ever wondered why? Spoiler alert, it's not just tradition. See, across the Appalachians to California, throughout Wisconsin and Northern America, cranberries have been one of the few things that were always indigenous to our country. That's why we abuse them to the moon and back, you know? Then you throw in canned cranberries and convenience stores popping up in every neighborhood, and well, you start to see how people end up with so many leftovers. Turkey and cranberry sandwiches would be made so often to dispose of leftover cranberries that it wouldn't be uncommon to see pretty much everyone at work pulling up with one of these, though that did mean they got old really fast. Probably why nobody brings them anymore, to be honest. Squirrel stew is also called Brunswick stew, which might be a more familiar name since it is very well known in the South. Squirrel stew typically has much more positive associations than the ones it is tied to in the Great Depression era. In some areas that were struck exceptionally badly, it was hard to get any kind of meat. Stews had already been made with tomatoes, onions, and other basic vegetables that were available, but they were missing protein. Using squirrel in stews began to be widely incorporated into the daily meals of families following the onset of the Depression. The poor neighborhoods relied on variations of this stew that worked with what they had for regular nutrition. You have to consider that these were families used to eating meat before the brunt of the era hit America, and so squirrel meat was a welcome change. Parmesan chicken who? The only friend I have here is veal parmesan, or as it's otherwise known in its homeland, veal parmigiana. This is something that just doesn't sound like it's in the appropriate tax bracket for this video, but bear with me. There is more than one way to enjoy a night out and feel like you're balling on top of it. Italian-American restaurants in the 50s had begun to really take off. They had become this national thing, you know? And one of the biggest hit sellers on their menu was veal parmesan, and it was common for families that dined out to not only try it, but to also recreate it. You had people using canned tomato sauce, though, like Hunt's or Del Monte and Kraft Parmesan, so that's how you knew you were still eating a little on the cheaper side. Actual veal parmesan in Italy has to use fresh tomato sauce and Parmigiano Reggiano. But hey, you gotta save money for that burrito wrap on the way to work, the cab fare both ways back, and the bills, you know? To start it off, we're going to keep it very healthy with egg salad stuffed tomatoes. This was supposed to be a really light twist on the usual egg salad, which, as far as salads went, performed really well. Now, tomatoes aren't exactly someone's first pick when it comes to eating healthy and making your food taste good. Do they work on things like pizzas and burgers? Of course, but they're always usually a background character, even in those types of dishes. Here, though, the tomato is supposed to be the star of the show. The thing is, you're eating a tomato that's been hollowed out completely and has been stuffed with egg salad. You ever seen those jalapenos that have been emptied out and stuffed with cheese or aromatics? It's kind of like that. Why did something like this ever go out of style? Well, in today's culture of waking up half an hour before your shift because you need every bit of sleep you can possibly imagine, it just doesn't make sense to have something that's so prep work heavy as your daily lunch. So the next list of items on the list is something that's pretty much firmly within the reach of an average middle-class budget. We're going to start off with chicken Kiev, which is essentially just these boneless and skinless chicken breasts. They weren't really so common in the 60s, but the idea here was that since whole chickens were decently cheaper, like around 30 cents a pound, home cooks would pretty much just debone them on their own. Nowadays, we're quite used to getting our meals deboned for us. Plus, eventually, frozen chicken Kiev that was pre-made became something that was available in supermarkets. This was part of the new wave of convenient gourmet options that basically meant high-class dishes that before were either something locked behind a skill barrier or financial incapability were now things everyone could enjoy. It was something you'd see in a lot of Russian and Ukrainian restaurants, but it was also something you'd see a lot in Eastern European communities too. Homemade cobbler was a dessert that was made pretty much throughout the year in the 50s. Sometimes people would go for canned fruit in the winter when most of them were out of season. But when they were in season in the summers, oh boy, people would go absolutely guerrilla over this. I mean, suburban moms pretty much just sustained their entire existence via peach cobblers. Okay, I'll be a fair judge, cherry and blackberry cobblers were also pretty competitive. The real fun, at least for me with a cobbler, is that lovely little dollop of vanilla ice cream that comes with it, or some whipped cream on the top. I feel like it really adds to the entire vibe, the same way a limousine makes you feel like, yeah, it's prom night. Most Southern families used shortcut versions of cobbler by having things like canned biscuits or pre-made baking mixes though, and they skipped the ice cream in favor of a more crispier golden crust via cast iron skillet cooking. The real Southern thing about this is the way people would literally make cobblers outdoors with Dutch ovens if they could. And hey, if they didn't even have that, would you make enough cobblers in your lifetime? You learned to do it over an open fire, and that was a real core memory for a lot of people. How else do you think cobblers became so popular? So pickled herring was affordable, and it cost pretty much just chump change for most people. It was one of the cheapest sources of protein, but here's where it really shined. The thing about pickled herring was that it was widely available in just about every area of America, thanks to the fact that it was always sold in jars and cans. I mean, you could take it fresh if you wanted to pickle at home, but that would just be getting yourself into a Sorry, I'll stop. Really, I know you guys have had to put up with more than a few bad puns lately. What you wouldn't have to put up with in the 60s was a bad snack option, because if you had any sense, you would pickled herring was a must-have in your pantry. Homes in Wisconsin, Minnesota, Michigan, and more states that were touched by Scandinavian and German culture, thanks either to the slowly developing effects of globalization or thanks to the immigrant populations present in the areas, would always make sure to have some herring lying around. Now, canned ham really is just an old classic. You've seen it in cartoons, you've seen it in movies, you've seen it probably way too many times in your friend's fridge, and you've probably rated it twice as many more times. Canned ham is the kind of thing that your wife makes for you when she's mad, instead of the usual loving meatloaf. But it's also the kind of thing you get so relieved to see when you see it sitting there, all by its lonesome in the cabinet, as your brain begins to experience a downpour of sandwich topping ideas. Hey, maybe you aren't a sandwich person. Maybe you like your ham in your salad. Maybe you like it as a pizza topping, or maybe you just wanted to stick it in your hot dog. The point of canned ham isn't how good it is and how nice it tastes, because let's be honest, after the 50th thousand time, I can't really feel the novelty either. The point is, every IM you see this, you know you're set, at least food-wise, yet it's at the same time something you would never see in a rich person's home, or even a lower-class person's home, because, well, one just didn't keep canned stuff and the other probably hunted their meat in the 50s. Escargot was definitely something I'd think twice or thrice about before I would claim that it was middle-class food. Back in the 1960s, $1 or $3 actually meant something. It wasn't petty chump change like it is now. Escargot would fetch you a price of $3 or even $3.50 per dozen at fine restaurants, and that made it something people would really have to save up for. You could go to gourmet markets and visit them to get canned snails and attempt a homemade version of escargot, but you wouldn't have fresh snails, so at some point or the other it was going to fall short. Luckily, at least everything else wasn't something that would stress your budget out. You had garlic butter, parsley, and bread, and that meant that you could pretty much make this dish with the stuff you had on hand. The only real costly ingredient here was the protein. The snail-eating thing is something that was common back then, by the way, and yes, it was another thing we were trying out just because it was French. Despite that, they were actually a lot more tame in terms of flavor than you would expect. Lots of people even claimed it was much more similar to mushrooms than anything else, really. It was an experience that was in the reach of middle-class people, but definitely not comfortably or frequently. As far as work lunches go, I can't lie. I think you can do better than cold potato and sausage salad. It's not really the worst thing to get in the world, but it's not something I want for my dear viewers. Just picture it yourself. You're at work, there's already an unnecessary scheduled HR meeting, someone's missing their shift, and your boss wants you to cover, And on top of all that, you open up your lunch only to find a perfectly below room temperature salad of, let's see, potatoes and sausages. I wouldn't blame you if you just skipped that entirely, went downstairs and got yourself a granola bar. Really. At least that fuels you, you know? Seriously though, this dish was trying to be really healthy, but one of the biggest things about following a healthy diet is how sustainable it is. Unfortunately for everyone, flavor is a big part of that, because it's the same with your work, you know? You like what you do. You feel like you don't work a day in your life. You eat what you like. You don't feel like you're dieting either. Crepes Suzette is yet another example of how their ideas with cooking spread to all facets of our menus and culture. Flour, eggs, milk, and sugar are all ingredients any American home chef would be familiar with. And it's not like oranges were any new flavors for people. I mean, we've had citrus dishes for centuries. What was new to a lot of people in and out of restaurants was a French technique known as flambé. This was basically something that required a lot of patience, delicate skill, precision, and a lot of Grand Marnier. But the end result was worth it. Thanks to that little skill barrier, though, it became something that was not the go-to for a lot of home chefs, but something that thrived in French restaurants that prided themselves on bringing you the authentic flavors of France in the comfort of America. These thin and delicate crepes were drenched in a citrusy and butter-heavy sauce, and they were quite the trend. Gelatin salads had pretty much went beyond being a conventional hit or a one-hit wonder by the 50s. They were on their way to cementing themselves as being a big part of American food history and culture. A massive reason for that was all the cookbooks and advertisements showcasing these super over-the-top, extravagant molded JellO creations that really drew home chefs. Nothing like interactive cooking to get a home chef busy, right? And the big companies knew that too. And they also knew that this was a country of people who liked their food savory a lot more than they liked it the other way around. Companies like Dole, Campbell's, and Kraft even pushed out their own gelatin recipes that highlighted all the different things you could do with JellO, like the ring around the tuna lime gelatin mold. That was from a cookbook, but it was really the advent of modern refrigeration that made JellO salad such a common thing for middle-class homes. Now, I'm not gonna lie, egg and olive sandwiches aren't making anyone's top 3 anytime soon, but they were pretty damn good for the value. I mean, a proper sandwich that's healthy, easy to carry, takes no work at all, and is cheap. That's just a good deal, and the kind of deal that you start compromising on your standards for just a tiny bit. I'm not exactly sure why this ever fell out of favor with people. I think maybe we just moved on from olives, or the specific combination of eggs and olives. Either way, this was one of the most common things to bring. Interestingly enough, though, depending on your neighborhood, office, and job, that would be completely untrue. Egg and olive sandwiches were more so something you would see in working to middle-class offices and neighborhoods exactly because they were so practical and affordable. You could throw a slice of cheese in there and some leftover ham, and you would pretty much be set for the rest of the shift. However, having that many fried eggs daily wasn't a good idea either. People would keep this in rotation around like 2 or 3 times in a day. Pigs in a blanket are like that one friend that can just fit into any crowd. They were hot dogs that were really cheap, like just about 30 to 40 cents per pound. The biscuit dough, which was usually just Pillsbury, made the entire preparation process a non-factor because you could really just do whatever it is you wanted since it was so easy now that there were ready-made variants of dough out there. It was something that dominated homes and neighborhoods, and there was a reason it was so popular with the middle class. For the actual wealthy people, it was considered a bit too unsophisticated, and for people who were working class, they couldn't afford to spend a lot of dollars on getting a sizable batch of pigs in a blanket. In the middle class, with their 3-bedroom homes, their cookouts, potlucks, and parties, this humble dish found the perfect place for itself to make a statement, and it definitely did. Rice salad with curry dressing is probably the epitome of the whole health consciousness movement that dominated so much of the second half of the 90s. Rice salad with curry dressing would also often be made with much healthier ingredients than what people were used to, such as brown rice, quinoa, and more. Bell peppers, cucumbers, and spinach were also popular ingredients to throw in there. To be honest, it's a bit like a chicken katsu curry rice bowl, but without the katsu curry or the fried chicken fillets. This was something we took inspiration from a lot of different cultures from. One of the most popular ones was the Mediterranean version, which really emphasized the use of olives. But people also tried spicier Spanish recipes or more tame and flavorful Italian ones. There were all kinds of ways to have your rice salad, but it was dishes like these that set the stage for curries to become a main, trendy food in America. Once something starts being a work lunch, you know it's made it to the big leagues. It summarizes a lot of what was going on in the 90s too. A push for more healthier food, a strong desire for transportable, easier-to-make recipes, and a fusion of different cultures, recipes, and ideas to basically create uncharted territory. Its golden days from the 20th century aren't something we have anymore, but it's still a knockout option to go for if you're trying to switch your lunch up a little. Eggplant parmesans were these really cheap summer trends that would just be around 40 cents per pound, but were wonderful ways of having eggplants. In Italian-American communities, especially in places like New Jersey and Chicago, these were so common because eggplants had always been a thing there, and they only increased after the events of the first half of the 20th century. Eggplants were easy to grow in those backyard gardens people had during the Depression, and Italian-Americans lent whatever knowledge they had of how to cook one as much as they could. It meant that everyone's culinary horizons expanded for the better, really. The taste here was phenomenal. You had these crispy layers of breaded eggplant that had completely soaked up the tomato sauce and were enveloped in decadent melted cheese. The sides of pasta or ziti were wonderful, and the stuffing of garlic gave it the perfect kick it needed. All in all, this was a fantastic way of having an eggplant. Now, beans were a staple, and pairing them with ham was a southern favorite. It was a hearty meal that would stick to your ribs. And let's be honest, who doesn't love a good bowl of beans and ham hocks? A variation of this was known as the United States Senate bean soup, or simply Senate bean soup, which was a soup made with navy beans, ham hocks, and onion. It was served in the dining room of the United States Senate every day, in a tradition that dates back to the early 20th century. The original version included celery, garlic, and parsley. One of the two versions used today includes mashed potatoes. The ham hocks added flavor to the beans, and the whole thing was slow cooked until the meat fell off the bone. It might not have been gourmet, but it was definitely satisfying. Potato soup was a dish that was much better depending on the situation, since sometimes you had a pretty hearty soup, and other times, a pretty basic one. Using ingredients that most would find in their homes any day of the year now, such as butter and milk, the recipe catered even to those families who often lacked these staples. They took just salt, pepper, and water to make a soup out of boiled potatoes that were sliced. The full recipe was definitely a delicious soup when it was made. Potato soup was also reserved for mostly important days or special occasions back then. Nowadays you might make it because you saw it on YouTube. Apple brown betties were usually the grand desserts of the Great Depression. Before the Depression, this dessert was made with pie crusts that were usually packed with cinnamon and apples sprinkled with breadcrumbs on top using things like brown sugar. You can definitely imagine by now that the apple brown betties of the Depression were vastly different. When ingredients were rare, these even had oatmeal fillings and whatever else was in the cabinet. This was a very weird moment in history because these takes on the brown betty were not really popular, but not unknown either, existing in that weird middle gap between what you could expect to find out 610 households to a wildly different Betty in each block. Stereotypical variations of the desert, as well as ones from the years following the stock market crash, are now just memories and grandma's recipes. Remember how I was talking about the way people just had enough of the typical meatball marathon? Well, grape jelly meatballs were a divisive one that tried to tackle that issue. Some people thought these fusion food, or as some would affectionately call them, frankenfoods, were going a bit too far, and others thought that we hadn't really started going far enough. There were obvious benefits to them, ones that couldn't really be debated, but the taste wasn't all there for a lot of people. Now, the benefits. These things were really affordable, so they were perfect for large-size gatherings. They were also really novel, and the combination of sweet grape jelly with those often really gamey-tasting meatballs was something that lots of Americans initially thought was fancy. It also came into finger foods, which meant that it was perfect for all kinds of parties. You'd see a lot of this dish in the Midwest and South, particularly in California and New York, which was really where the trend of party food first erupted. Hoover's stew got its name from President Hoover, who was blamed for the economic hardship of the 30s. It was a hodgepodge of whatever ingredients you had on hand, thrown together in a pot and cooked until it was tender. It might have included meat, potatoes, carrots, and other vegetables, and was a way to use up leftovers. The hot dogs provided protein, the canned vegetables added some much-needed nutrients, and the pasta helped to bulk up the dish. Hoover stew came about during the Great Depression in the early 1930s. Folks had to pinch a penny so hard they'd make Lincoln cry, as they used to say. This stew is a tasty way to stretch $1 to feed more people or to make a meal with enough leftovers to take care of the next day's meals. Depression cake has a name that catches your eye, but it also suits the type of dish it was. Sugar, butter, and eggs were getting much harder to obtain, and even milk would not remain an easily buyable item. This cake was thus made with a recipe that had to use none of that, which actually made it realistic enough to be applicable. Following the 1929 crash of the market, all of the normal cake ingredients soared in prices. Bakeries quickly created an alternative recipe and aptly named it Depression cake. The recipe used baking powder, water, and butter, instead of the other ingredients typically necessary for any basic cake that people are used to eating today. This was a cake that set a precedent in that era because it would inspire things like the mock apple pie. The trend of mock food is almost completely gone nowadays, but for families that wanted to still have cake, this came close enough. Corned beef hash was another famous dish similar to the ones we have been talking about on this list. Food analysts all over the world associate corned beef hash with Great Depression cuisine, as it was a way to get out of the patterns of mock foods and instead be a cheap and unique dish. Unfortunately, the meal was not that great or beloved, though it provided necessary vegetables and protein, so it gained popularity. Thick gravy in a cheap, widely available can suddenly became the go-to food for many households. When you think of beef, keep in mind that this meant anything from what was on hand, whether that was a fresh can of beef or leftovers from the last soup you had. Corned beef hash was also on the menus of diners around the states, where you could get beef hash for as low as 75 cents, though those restaurant prices are in the distant past. If any of these dishes stirred a memory or made you wonder what else we've left behind, share your favorite in the comments. Tap like so others find it too, and subscribe to keep these stories on the table.